Thank you very much, Phil. Yeah, so as Phil said, I'm going to be talking about strengthening ourselves through prayer and worship today. So every year, Joel writes our family Christmas letter. We've done one ever since we got married, and it's a tradition that we've taken from his family. And it's always been our desire that it's not just going to be like a list of all the things we've accomplished this year, like all of the amazing and beautiful holidays that we haven't been on, and all the kind of amazing things that our kids have done, or just a general celebration of how frankly wonderful we are as human beings. You know, you've all had those kind of letters, you know, the round robins that put an Instagram filter on life. Like when I was a kid, we always received one from a family who had daughters, right? And I'm from a family of three daughters, so it was always a little bit stressful. And this family genuinely seemed to be on a mission to save the world. There was one daughter who had started and was running her own really successful charity. And I think the other two were like a pediatric surgeon and like a professional musician doing like music therapy with vulnerable kids. Every year, this would drop through the door, and I'd just be like, these guys, these guys are incredible. They are clever, they are beautiful, they are altruistic. What amazing lives they lead. Meanwhile, I'm sat there at like 14, 15, 18 in my pajamas, probably having spent the morning procrastinating from doing my homework or my violin practice or whatever else I should have been doing that morning. So when John and I decided that we were going to do our own Christmas letter together, we didn't want it to be like that. We wanted it to be a little bit more real, a bit more like self-effacing, a little bit more reflective of the messy and chaotic and love-filled world that is our family most of the time. If you were a lucky recipient of our missive this year, you would have found yourself regaled with anecdotes about our robot Hoover and our overly ambitious winter strolls. And hopefully we achieve a bit of balance. But even then, what you're getting is an airbrush summary of our year. By the very nature of the fact that we're selecting events in our life to talk about, we're not going to dwell on the darker moments we had in 2020, right? The day-to-day struggles, the exhaustion of having two kids all the time, with nowhere to go and no one to see, the struggles of adapting to working from home for Joel, where he's missing the companionship and the structure that, you know, being in the office would give him. Or just trying to keep all the plates spinning and feel like we're doing all of them badly, right? None of those things are in our Christmas letter. And honestly, we're okay. Like, we're fine. We're being looked after. Bob and Sarah are amazing. Dave and Bridget are amazing. But I share these things with you because I want you to know that we all suffer. And suffering seems like such a big word. Suffering feels like something that happens to starving children in Africa, or those people in conflict zones, or those who are grieving loved ones in this pandemic. And of course, all of that is true. But we suffer from this in small things too. As we go through life, we pick up bumps and bruises, scars from our journey along the way that can shape who we are and our relationships and experiences moving forward. We all suffer in different ways through physical and mental illness, through grief and loneliness, bullying, miscarriages, abuse, relationship breakdown, and the day to day wearing down of everyday life. We all suffer. And those scars can affect us. And if we're not careful, they affect us and wear us down, not just physically and mentally, but spiritually too. They can draw us away from God. Suffering and our response to it is a major theme of this sermon series. Previously, we've had Dave talk about the importance of recounting our story, reminding ourselves that God is good and making sure that our theology, that what we believe about God is based on knowing that God is good. And we've had Phelim talking to us about how to pause like Mr. Jelly, how to stop and discern God's heart in situations. So today I'm going to talk about being strengthened through praise and worship. Why do we praise and worship even when we're living in the non-Christmas letter worthy moments? Ultimately, worship is good for the soul because it recenters us on God and it builds our relationship with Him. And to explore that today, we're going to set out to discover the link between King David and the London 2012 Olympic opening ceremony. Let's start with King David. Right on the face of it, he is a man who has everything going for him, right? He's described as this man who was glowing with health and had a fine appearance and handsome features. He's a talented musician. He's a successful soldier given a high rank in the army. And he was anointed while he was still a very young man, probably just a teenager, to be the God chosen king of Israel, a man after God's own heart. Well, quite a lot as it turns out. Traditionally, there can only be like one king at a time. So when the current king finds out that you've been anointed while he's still reigning, he's liable to get a little bit twitchy about it. Twitchy enough to throw spears at you while you're playing a harp for him, or to send you into battle with the hope that you're going to die, and eventually to force you to flee from your home and to persecute and hunt you through the hills and country around Judah. David endured some horrendous times, and just how close he came to despair is captured in the Psalms, nowhere more so than in the start of Psalm 22, when David feels abandoned not just by his country, but by his God. This is where we're going to spend a lot of our time today. So if you have a Bible, it's probably worth opening it to Psalm 22. I'll read you just the first couple of verses. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, but I find no rest. This is a psalm that Jesus quotes as he's dying on the cross. David feels abandoned by God, so far from him. I'm sure that we've all felt like that during the hardest times of our lives. He comes falling to God on his knees in prayer like a little child would to a loving father, crying out for the help in real honesty. There's no filtering the pain that he's going through here. He doesn't try and dress it up for God and pretend, it's not too bad or that he's coping with it. He's not. He's raw. It's not a case of, I can see what you're doing with this, Lord, or I can see that you're making me a way through. It's, why are you so far from saving me, so far from my cries of anguish? This stuff is real. When I was 15, I found myself in a wheelchair after an operation. In a wheelchair, in huge amounts of pain, and with no real hope of recovery. I wasn't really a Christian. I was in the sense that I'd been confirmed into the Church of England and I'd sung in the church choir. And I think I probably believed there was a God, but I had no real deep-seated beliefs of my own that I could articulate in any way. And I certainly didn't have like a personal relationship with Jesus that I could fall back on. And it never really occurred to me to bring any of what I was going through to God, to bring any of the pain or the anger or the hopelessness or the sheer lostness that I felt as a teenager, having had my life thrown up in the air and unsure of what the next steps would be. Instead, between myself and my frankly incredibly compassionate and competent family, it became an operation in coping, of doing things in our own strength. I wanted to complete my GCSEs and A-levels at the same school that I was currently attending, which just happened to be on a 1 in 3 hill and completely inaccessible. So my parents bought ramps and they fitted them in the school so that I could access my lessons, and they hired someone to push me around between them so that I could attend. I wanted to play sports, and the sports that I'd been playing that led me to get injured. So we'd travel for hours every week to get me between different sports clubs and tournaments so that I could have the equivalent experience of my non-disabled peers. Honestly, it was quite impressive. But it was all done in our own strength. So it left all of us, myself and my parents and my sisters, exhausted, mentally and physically exhausted, with nowhere left to turn. You can imagine that David felt something similar at the start of Psalm 22. Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish? But the next verses show how he responds to God in this desperation. Whilst feeling abandoned and alone, he still knows God to be true. Yet you are enthroned as the Holy One. You are the one that Israel praises. Other translations have it as you are enthroned on Israel's praises. In you, our ancestors put their trust. They trusted in you and you delivered them. To you, they cried out and were saved. In you they trusted and were not put to shame. Here we find the reason for David's hope, the reason that he hasn't given up, and the reason that even though he feels far from God right now, he still believes in God's goodness. He still worships and praises him because God delivered his ancestors. So he trusts that God is going to deliver him from the current situation too. Even though he can't see his hand at work at the moment, even though there is not an earthly way that David could make it through himself, even though he can't see how God is possibly going to do it, he trusts that he will because he's God and he's sovereign and he's done it before. In contrast, the familiar investment phrase, with God, past performance is an indicator of future results. Psalm 136 tells us that God's steadfast love endures forever. We worship God in the hard times because he's the same God as he was in the good times. He loves us just as much now as he did then. When I was pregnant with Isaac, I found myself in a wheelchair again. I was in pain again, but this time it was not without hope. We had no reason to believe I'd get better after he was born. We were told it could go either way, that it might even make things worse. There was a risk there that I could end up paralyzed from the neck down. But still, it was not without hope. Because what had changed in those intervening years was my personal relationship with God. He healed me when I was 21. I'd been in a wheelchair almost 7 years, and he healed me and brought me out of it. And in response, I've become a Christian. I've been baptized. And in the time between being healed and being pregnant with Isaac, God and I had been on quite a journey of a relationship. Everything was done at 100 miles an hour. I fell in love with this personal, compassionate, and awesome God, and I fell in love hard. I was all in. So when I was pregnant and sick, and I was really quite sick, it was never hopeless. It was rubbish. And sometimes when I hadn't eaten for days and I couldn't think straight and I was high on all of the medications, it felt pretty desperate. But it was never hopeless. Because with God, past performance is an indicator of future results. The God that healed me once could do it again. But even if he didn't, he would still love me and my husband and my child, and he still died to save me. So we worship that God. We lift our hands to the heavens and we say, Holy One, you're the one that we praise. You delivered me from situations in the past, and I trust that you're going to do it again. You are still good. Worship is something we do for God and to God. It's a sense of thankfulness for what he's done, sure, but it's also a declaration of who he is. And it's a ministry that, just like it did for David, takes all of our physical and mental and emotional effort. It's something that we don't do half-heartedly or with a part of our brain in the state of the house or what's for dinner. It's something we put our all into, so much so that it becomes a sacrifice that draws heaven just a little bit closer to earth. Sing louder, let this place erupt with praise. Can you hear it? The sound of heaven touching earth. It's so much easier to feel when we're all together, isn't it? When you've got Bitty and Jess and Ella and Dave and Alicia and Phelan just pouring their hearts into these glorious vocals next to you and giving that all as they worship God. You get this kind of positive peer pressure to worship when we're all together that's hard to replicate when we're at home. But worship isn't about musical perfection. It's about an outpouring of our love for God, giving him the glory for the things that he has done. Even if that's half a semitone flat all the way through, he doesn't care because he hears your heart. And this act of wholehearted, sacrificial worship does stuff to us too. I said earlier that worship is good for the soul, and it is. It strengthens us. It strengthens us through a recognition of who we are and who the God is that we serve. It forces us to recognize that he is God and we are not. And it helps us to humble ourselves and give God the glory that he deserves and the permission to work in our lives. When you hear rugby players talk about the preparation they do for big games, you often hear them talk about how they concentrate on their own game and they don't worry about what the opposition are going to do. And I always find that fascinating because they have whole teams of analysts who are looking at the opposition, finding holes in their defence, and picking out the players that are most dangerous and likely to need the closest marking. So, what's the point of them if all you're doing is focusing on your own game? But in truth, what they're doing in their preparation is they're focusing on the things that they can control. It's a way of reducing anxiety, increasing empowerment, and a sense of responsibility. It's our job to do our best. And if we win, it's because we played our best and we were better than them. And if we lose, it's because we played our best and they were better than us. It's a way of reducing those peaks and those troughs of emotions, the highest of highs when they win and the lowest of lows and recriminations when they lose. Worship is like that too. In worship and praise and prayer, we acknowledge what is of us and what is of God. We acknowledge that, as Jesus says in John 15, apart from me, you can do nothing. Worship helps us to stop trying to control the things we can't control. It gives us a security about who we are and what our purpose is. And it builds strength and peace through a deeper relationship with our Creator God, who we were made to worship. Worship takes us into the house of our Father. It opens wide the gates of heaven. And what better source of strength could we draw on as we go through the hardest of times? Worship is good for the soul because it recenters us on God and it builds our relationship with Him. I promised you a link between King David and the London 2012 Olympic opening ceremony, and here it is. I want to leave you guys with the lyrics from a hymn that was sung that night that I think really encapsulates the spirit of David and what I've been talking about today. It's a hymn that's often used at funerals, written by a pastor only weeks from dying with TB, based on words that he'd heard a friend say as he'd laid dying years before. Definitely not a hymn born of the height of happiness, but it's a hymn that recognizes the godliness of God, the awesome nature of his character, and the hope that we have in him, even at the darkest of times. I'll leave a link to the YouTube video of it in the comments on Facebook and the Zoom chat so you can go away and listen to the whole thing. But let me just leave you with a couple of verses of Abide with Me. Abide with me, fast falls the eventide. The darkness deepens, Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, abide with me. Swift to its close, ebbs out life's little day. Earth's joy grows dim, its glories pass away. Change and decay in all around I see. O thou who changes not, abide with me. I fear no foe with thee at hand to bless. Ills have no weight and tears no bitterness. Where is death's sting? Where grave thy victory? I triumph still if thou abide with me. Hold thou thy cross before my closing eyes, shine through the gloom and point me to the skies. Heaven's morning breaks and earth's vain shadows flee. In life, in death, O Lord, abide with me. Thanks, Phil.